I want to thank, at the outset, both Olives and Otto and those many colleagues of theirs that have put this terribly important gathering together. I think I've had the pleasure of being associated with the Baltic Security Foundation now for 3 years, and it's filling a very important niche that, in my mind, was heretofore largely unattended. I mean, you can't find the front lines of freedom in a more visceral, direct way unless you're in the Donbass or Kherson or other of the war-torn areas of Ukraine itself. These folks are obviously under immediate threat in a way that makes us feel secure, relatively speaking, in the Czech Republic and elsewhere in the region. And it's been a pleasure and an honor to help in a small way on the solicitation of funding and support for such a worthy enterprise that I think is only going to go one way, and that's straight up. And taking on the Nordic region more broadly is obviously the right way to go, particularly pertaining to China. And it's staying ahead of the curve, because although we certainly get the picture in Technicolor on the Russians and have for a long time, the Chinese portfolio is a more subtle, a more insidious affair that's disguised by money to a large extent and deals too good to be true. It's very hard on the human condition to be faced with the temptations of a China, and so many people succumb to their line that they really are about a peaceful rise, and they really are about cooperation and taking advantage of joint opportunities. That's not what the true record shows, as we're increasingly discovering, some of us a lot sooner than others. I've been in that camp for well over 25 years, and if I may say, have seen our Chinese friends for what they are, which are the preeminent existential threat to the United States and to freedom worldwide, including, of course, the Russians themselves. So the wake-up call has not been adequately received by Europe, much less the region. And this is starting to happen in 2019 through 2021, when you could call it the awakening of foreign direct investment screening, for example. And in the case of Norway, the choice of Ericsson over Huawei. I mean, things are happening, but they're happening at a glacial pace, and it's in some cases too little, too late. Kulka in Germany comes to mind, and how many other major losses of technology of a strategic nature have we already experienced? And when we have a rare victory where they're blocked, we celebrate, but that's after scores have gone through. So I think we have to temper our self-congratulations with the idea that we are losing at some level to the predations of the Chinese. And it is reminiscent of a story that I'd like to quickly go through because it's so applicable to China, a story of misreading, miscalculation, greed, naivete, and permitting undue dependency. And that rolls the clock back to the early 1980s and late 70s when we were grappling with the same kind of decisions that we're making now, which was dealing with Soviet natural gas deliveries to Western Europe and the twin-strand 3,600-mile Siberian gas pipeline that it is, in effect, Nord Stream 1 and 2, that we were confronted with all those years ago. There was no such thing as pipeline politics. There was no evidence of the Soviets weaponizing natural gas deliveries. There was, in fact, just the opposite, a European theology that said they would never jeopardize their role as a reliable supplier. It just doesn't make any business sense. They're not self-destructive, blah, blah, blah. And it wouldn't happen. And of course, we know the outcome of that. But it was a very tough struggle. I came to the National Security Council from Chase Manhattan Bank, where I was Vice President, Division Executive, in charge of the Soviet Union, Eastern Central Europe, and Yugoslavia for 5 years. And in the creditworthiness assessments that are incumbent on every banker, I learned where all the money is, particularly the hard currency, and came to understand that they had total hard currency income in 1981 of about $32 billion, which was about 1/3 of the annual revenues of Exxon or General Motors at the time. And they were running an empire from Havana to Hanoi, primarily on barter and ruble trade, but the hard currency piece was, well, by today's standards, it's ridiculously minute, but it was very low then too, 66% of which then and now is oil and gas deliveries. We still have a non-diversified economy, of course, and we're facing the same Russia as we did, largely the Soviet Union before it. And I wrote a piece in the New York Times in April of 1981, while still with Chase, called Europe's Big Gamble on Soviet Gas, with a map and the whole thing. I did a longer piece that spring in the Washington Quarterly of CSIS, for those that might know that think tank, that was called Soviet Gas, Risk or Reward. And it was the second piece that was in draft seen by the president, and turned out, who I didn't know the Reagan people or the administration, and it turns out that that was used as the basis for his interventions with our allies at the Ottawa Economic Summit in July of 1981. So we've been to this rodeo before. We were greeted with great hostility by Europe, as you may know, particularly names that spring to my mind as I'm here in Berlin: Helmut Schmidt, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, Otto von Lambsdorff, Egon Bahr, Wolfram Orengen, and later on Alfred Herrhausen of Deutscher, many others. And I could spend a lot of time just on the list. It's not every day you name names, but I think it's indicated here, because the level of contempt for Reagan was so extreme that he would have the temerity to try to tell them how to run their affairs vis-a-vis what is and what is not an inordinate level of dependency. Mind you, all of the equipment and technology used for the pipeline were under US licenses, because we were the only one that had developed such technology because of the North Slope in Alaska. Nobody knew how to get through permafrost. Nobody had diamond drill bits like we did. Nobody could build turbines and rotors of the type that we could do then. No one in the world. And so this was our technology, our equipment, and we judged it to be so via US law, which, when exercised later, led to one of the great extraterritorial legal battles of all time that's still going on, in effect. So it was a blood on the floor event. And we finally, the epilogue was that we got a cap of 30% dependency on Soviet gas of total West European deliveries in the International Energy Agency in May of 1983. We eliminated subsidized terms on government loans to Moscow, which were getting below market terms, subsidized by Western taxpayers, because they were under the category of a developing country. The same gambit, incidentally, that China uses today in the World Bank. They're supposed to be the hard luck case, these folks that have a limitless checkbook to buy countries, regions, and in the case of Africa continents, we're supposed to see as a hard luck case. And in any event, and later we convinced the Saudis secretly to pump 2 million barrels a day more. We decontrolled prices at the wellhead in the United States to take oil to $10 a barrel, knowing that for every dollar drop in the price of a barrel of oil, Moscow was losing roughly $1 billion a year in income from the paltry $32 billion that they started with. Well, guess what? That's unsustainable. And a couple of days prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union, it's little remembered that they defaulted on $96 billion in Western debt. And if you see a connection, bravo, because every other excuse for the takedown of the Soviet Union is used, except that one. Gorbachev's a secret Democrat with democratic instincts, the rigidities of the Soviet economy. We're going to take it down anyway. Anything but to say that it was the visionary policies of Ronald Wilson Reagan. But it was. And for those that want to look at the national security decision directives underpinning it, I suggest NSDD 75, NSDD 66. I could go on about that too. It's all a matter of record. It's all spelled out in Technicolor. But I'm not going to dwell on this except to say, look at where we are vis-a-vis Chinese consumer goods in Europe. We have a major dependency there that folks are very concerned about. And as I say, the allure of the Chinese market, that you're going to sell those billion widgets. The China dream, if you will, our China dream as opposed to that of President Xi, is having some bonanza in the Chinese marketplace that never seems to quite materialize. So it's taken a good while, and the war, it's been stated today, is a watershed event. There's the world prior to the war against Ukraine, and there's the world after. And I'm an adherent to that view. I think that you can't turn the clock back on this kind of carnage and this kind of brute force display. And obviously, we've just witnessed a level of belligerence by Beijing in Taiwan and the waters around Taiwan that make it abundantly clear that it's not beyond them to play the same game, whether it's starving them out by blockade or a flat-out invasion. China is not exactly subtle about its intentions. Also, you notice that Nancy Pelosi had to fly around the South China Sea islands when trying to get to Taiwan to begin with, which she might not have realized was a salute to Chinese domination of the South China Sea, in a sense. It's not to say I object to safety, but really? Those two-bit man-made islands are now bristling with air defense, and you know how that story of lies and subterfuge played out vis-a-vis Beijing. So gratefully, there's pushback in Europe. The 16+1 is now -3 members in the Baltic states, thank God. And all of this fraudulent diplomacy is starting to become, I hope, unraveled. And as I say, there seems to be a greater consciousness on technology security, that's also for sure. But when you look at European concerns, and I have, it's environment, corruption, and working conditions. I mean, the Swedes dropped 2 Chinese companies from their pension fund. And I said to myself, I saw that, and I saw the names of the companies, which are well-known PLA companies, huge companies. And I said, finally, that we're going to start to cut off the money to national security and human rights abusers. There's some recognition that they should not be in the portfolios of West European investors. And then I read the fine print, and they left because one of the companies had expanded its coal production, and the other had violated environmental norms in Tanzania. It sounds like almost a joke that I'm making this up. And I fashion myself an environmentalist, and I'm not trying to give short shrift to environmental concerns. But in the name of God, you know, how does that compare with equipping concentration camps, with trafficking in slave labor, with aiding and abetting genocide, with PLA manufacturers of advanced weapon systems to be used against US and allied forces? Not to mention the creation and militarization of those islands in the South China Sea, and too long a list to name. All the IP theft that you're worried about, all the espionage in universities and elsewhere. All of this tab, if you will, is picked up principally by US investors, but also those of Western Europe. Over the past, say, 7 years, we've moved in wealth between 3–6 trillion out of the portfolios of about 150 million average retail American investors to the coffers of the Chinese Communist Party. That's trillions with a T. Well, that's astonishing. And those 150 million, in all of their investment portfolios that have any international exposure at all, they're holding those equipping the concentration camps and those trafficking in the slave labor. All of those offenses that I just mentioned are being funded unwittingly by Americans who have there's no disclosure, there's no regulatory oversight. Certainly when they buy A shares from Chinese exchanges directly into the portfolios of index providers and then into investment products like exchange-traded funds, mutual funds, and so-called index funds. That's where it is, and that's where it is in Europe as well. So it's a very sad commentary that we have over the past 20 years in the United States, we've had no outbound investment screening. We've had no protections of our capital markets. We've not looked at who's even sanctioned by the United States. Most of the sanctioned companies are in the portfolios of the American people today because it's not illegal. You can be on the entity list, as 500 Chinese companies are, which means you can't access American equipment technology because you've been such an egregious human rights and national security abuser, but you're free to be in the portfolios of the American people so that you can raise money from them. Do you know how many of those 500 companies are on the Treasury list that are excluded from the US capital markets? 13. Does that sound like a serious policy? Does that sound like Treasury and the National Economic Council and the SEC really care? No, it doesn't, because they don't. They care more about protecting Wall Street fees than they care about the safety and security of American investors, our national security, and our fundamental values as expressed through human rights. And the same is true with Europe. We did a study of the Frankfurt Stock Exchange, and it showed these were the findings. Now, again, I'm not trafficking in opinion here. I traffic in empirical fact, and the numbers don't lie. And that's why you'd think that we would be able to get people's attention to the obvious. The answer is no, because the Wall Street lobby and its equivalents in Europe have that much power. It's a cynical game, and it just doesn't quit. And I would just say that, I'll close and go open it for questions, but let me give you some good news. I've given you a lot of bad news. Let me give you some good news. The United States has 66% of the world's liquidity. Cash, right? Our capital markets are roughly the size of the rest of the world's combined. We hold the world's reserve currency in the dollar. Do we want allies with us in this quest to cut off and defund the CCP? Of course we do. Do we need them? Do we need the European allies and Japan and others to join us to be effective? The answer is no. This is in our hands, just like our monopoly control of oil and gas equipment and technology in the early 80s. We took those decisions unilaterally. We can take those decisions unilaterally today at the drop of a hat. And last week, 6 of Chinese largest companies delisted themselves from the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ because they knew they were dead on arrival a month or two from now when they were going to be forced out and wanted it to save face and look like it was their decision. In other words, things are changing in the United States. We've got lobbies. We've got thousands of Americans engaged in this who are as mad as hell, and they're not going to take it anymore because there's one central feature to this thing that's just as true with Europe, and that is, this is our money. This isn't some abstraction. We're not talking about space-based missile defense here. This is our money, your money. And you can just say no, and we are saying just no in the United States, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Robinson, for your speech, which I'm sure will pave a great way for our following finance domain panel discussion. But before we do that, perhaps we can take a few questions and have Mr. Robinson answer to them collectively, should we have them at this moment. Yes.
Hello, my name is Jens Bastian. I'm a researcher on China, in particular in the Eastern Mediterranean. In light of what you've just said, sir, defunding the CCP and that unilateral action on the part of the United States is possible. How do you then explain that recent data shows that the US Commerce Department has approved almost every application for technological exports to China?
Cynicism, incompetence, greed immediately come to mind. Feathering nests for a return to corporate America comes to mind. Read conflict, and some would less politely call it corruption. Right? That's where we are. Under the Trump administration, the lead fella and the lead 2 people that were trying to stop the kind of discipline and transparency and disclosure and do something about the fact that not one of the over 5,200 Chinese companies in the U.S. capital markets are compliant with U.S. federal securities laws. Not one permit audits. Not one discloses its financials. Just a complete black box whereby China received preferential treatment to their American corporate counterparts. Steve Mnuchin at Treasury, Jay Clayton at the SEC. And so you don't have to go to just an administration like the Biden administration to find the problem. You follow the money, and it's going to take you to those American regulators, supposed regulators, that just sort of happen not to do their jobs. And so I don't have a good answer. I mean, that is the answer. It's not pretty, but there it is.
Following on from that question, how do you view the outbound screening investment? How important do you think that new move will be? It's being watched fairly closely in some quarters in Europe, but it would presumably help this problem immeasurably, wouldn't it?
Yeah, yes, in a nutshell. Whether you call it outbound investment controls or whether you call it investment bans or whether you call it, proper diligence and disclosure and forcing compliance with securities laws, there are lots of ways to depict this. But in terms of the order of magnitude of importance, this is hundreds of billions a year out of Europe flowing into the coffers of the Chinese Communist Party. We're bemoaning the fact that $1 billion a day, courtesy of missteps by Germany and other European allies, is flowing to the Putin war machine a day, still, roughly speaking at least. And we should properly bemoan that because it's propping up the Russian economy, such as it is, at least to a substantial extent, and it's resulting in unspeakable horrors in Ukraine with the civilian population and more. And so how do we feel about hundreds of billions that's flowing to China? You're telling me that foreign direct investment controls is capturing, what are they capturing? $1 billion a year of technology? Yeah, it can be critical. It can be robotics. It can be AI. It can be stuff that would advance materially Chinese military infrastructure, for example. So it's terribly important, but it's not a fingernail of the importance of the outbound investment that conveniently receives no debate. And if you found some debate on the matter, I'm curious as to where, but it's got to be just in a nascent stage because you don't want to talk about it in polite company. I mean, it's that kind of thing that's so baffling to me.
Thanks. Mr. Robinson, thanks for your excellent and really very sharpened presentation and all your speech. This is really challenging. In your opinion, if there is any, but how Europe and Americas can jointly respond to these challenges, what would be your 3 recommendations for the joint response?
Well, we don't really have to worry about Five Eyes materials so much because all of this is happening in open plain sight. This is open source intelligence, as they say. So you don't need to get into a highly classified environment to make the discoveries I'm talking about today. You need to pick up the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg and the FT each day like I do, and there it is. Not to mention, of course, other operations like Reuters and too many others to name. So it's not hard to find the information. What's difficult is it should be led by Treasury. It should be led by the Exchequer. It should be led by the Ministry of Finance. By the way, a quick story. The Ministry of Economy in Germany used to be Otto von Lambsdorff, who's known to many of you, I'm sure. And I used to work for David Rockefeller as a personal assistant at Chase. And David was in a meeting with Otto von Lambsdorff after I had briefed him on the way over about the fact that West European dependency on Soviet gas was going to go to 75 and 80% if the Siberian gas pipeline, 2 strands were fully subscribed. and that it would double their hard currency income, roughly, and it would kill the Troll gas field in Norway and any secure alternatives, because the Soviets can always underprice, like the Russians, any secure alternative supplies. That's what they do. And David mentioned to von Lambsdorff these statistics, that it'll go to 75, 80%. He asked if von Lambsdorff was troubled, as he was, to hear these levels of inordinate dependency. And there are three of us in the room. And Lambsdorff, I just sort of blended in to the wall over there. I was just a young lad listening. And von Lambsdorff said, well, that's all true. But you needn't worry, David, because the German people will never be told above 38%. So just reflect on that for a moment. These are the agencies of government that are supposed to be taking the lead in a question like Olaf's, which is, why don't we have a coordinated allied response? And of course, the job falls to the Treasury departments and the ministries of finance, and they're wholly owned subsidiaries to a large extent of Wall Street because of the revolving door. The head of the National Economic Council is BlackRock. The Deputy Secretary of Treasury today is BlackRock. It's not that I'm accusing these folks of necessarily being conflicted or worse, but it's a well-known, lubricated story, and it's at the root of why nothing ever happens on the money. Yeah, trade and tariffs, yeah, we got that. Technology security, yeah, we got that. What about the money? Why do we think the Soviet Union went down? It's because we crushed their hard currency cash flow. We cut off their sources of external finance. We destroyed their energy sector on a pricing basis. That's why they were driven into the dirt, and 300 million people went free without a shot fired. That's what happens when you're using the economic and financial domain properly in the positions that we find ourselves in as owning that economic and financial domain on the planet Earth. So that is the root of the problem, because the folks we're looking to for leadership are Wall Street guys and gals. I mean, if you really want to put it simply. So there we are.
Thank you.